But it's the big dilemma when you're making policy interventions in this kind of space, because ultimately you want people to change because they see the value of the change, not because there's some external measure that says we're going to judge you on this thing. But we know from experience that change like that can be incredibly slow. And, when you introduce something like the ref into this, it has the potential to accelerate that change, but at the same time, make that change less valuable or well embedded. And so, that's always a dilemma with any kind of policy intervention. And, we had similar discussions and arguments about open access and the introduction of open access requirements into the ref, where, those of us who advocate for open access and believe it's the right thing, we would love everyone just to decide it's the right thing to do and to do it. But the reality is that if you rely on that, change is going to be incredibly slow. And it was incredibly slow in terms of open access, but funders putting in mandates and, an introduction of a requirement in the ref massively accelerated that change, but it hasn't embedded the rationale for that change. It's just caused people to comply. And then maybe over time, compliance leads to a kind of appreciation of benefits and a more embedded kind of change. So yeah, it's a big dilemma, but equally, you can't really, if you want to see a change in the system and you have policy levers to pull, you can't really stand back and not pull them and say, well, we'll just wait for things to evolve.
Welcome to What the Ref, our attempt at demystifying everyone's favourite national research assessment exercise. So today we have, I think, a pretty good guest. What do you reckon, Gemma?
Oh my goodness, we've got the best guest ever today.
Okay, so we've got Stephen Hill, who was the Director of Research England. And he's come onto the podcast to talk about his time at Research England, the ref, and what he's doing next. So I think we should just get straight into the interview.
Let's go. Well, Stephen, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here on the podcast. Welcome. I guess we'll just head straight into the interview.
Yeah, it's great. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Brilliant. So you've been at Research England for a long time, or you were at Research England for a long time. And so you've had the pleasure of seeing, many different refs and RAEs and all of the different things over the years. Can you just tell us what you see were the major changes in the ref and how it's evolved since you were at Research England?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think it's really important to look at the ref on that long time scale. That change happens, but it tends to happen over that long time scale. So I think there are some big changes that have happened in the time I've been involved directly, which is from the end of Ref 2014 through to the beginning of Ref 2029. The big one maybe is the positioning of staff relative to the exercise, where in 2014, you had this very tight linkage between individual performance and ref performance, with every member of staff having to provide 4 outputs to the exercise. And over those 3 refs, that has been changed in quite a dramatic way, where in Ref 2021, that moved to much more flexibility, where there was a range of output numbers required for each staff member, through to Ref 2029, where the approach is to break that link completely and focus on the institutional contribution. So that's been a really major change. I guess the other massive change over that period was the introduction of assessment of societal impact, which was entirely new in 2014, and now I would say is embedded and perhaps even uncontroversial, which is quite a remarkable change over that period.
Yeah, I remember in 2014, impact was a Frankenstein monster, I think it was pretty much called at that particular point in time, whereas now it's just part of everyday life, and it's, as you said, the least controversial part of the ref.
Yeah.
Just about the staff outputs, why do you think it took so long for them to uncouple staff outputs from performance? I mean, you said that it was in RAE, it was in Ref 2014, and we had Ref 2021, and now we're doing Ref 2029. That's a long period of time. Why did it take so long?
I think it's because, again, this is looking back over the long arc of research assessment. the previous RAEs prior to REF 2014, that had just been the paradigm in those exercises for a number of iterations, across, what was it? I remember the dates correctly. I think it's RE 92 and then 2001 and 2008. And there was probably even one before 92 that had the same sort of approach. So it was a deeply embedded approach. And I still think when you talk to some people in the sector now, it's still a challenge or a struggle to move away from that idea of, we build our submission by getting each researcher to identify their top 4, and that's how we build the submission. That kind of thinking is still there in the sector, even though the exercise itself has moved on.
Yeah, definitely. So obviously, since RAE 1992 all the way up to REF 2029, there's been a lot of misunderstandings, and there's been a lot of noise trying to get rid of the REF based on, very legitimate, but some not so legitimate rationales. What do you think people misunderstand about the REF? What is the main, points of contention and misunderstanding?
I think one of the things that I think doesn't inform some of those debates about whether we should get rid of the REF or not is quite how fundamental it is in the kind of broader policy sphere around the funding flows that flow into universities. So, making the case for the unhypothecated QR funding is incredibly hard. It's difficult for ministers and government officials to understand the value of that funding stream. And if that funding stream were completely decoupled from any measure of quality or performance, it would be an order of magnitude harder to make the case. So that's really an important factor that sits on the benefit side when you're looking at the costs and benefits of the REF that sometimes gets lost in the debate. Partly because the impact of QR isn't super transparent to even researchers, on the ground in universities. But I think that's one of the issues in that kind of we don't need the REF type of argument.
Sorry, I interrupted there. I was about to lead into another question, but you go ahead. Sorry.
Well, the other thing I was going to say is that, in terms of misunderstandings about the REF, the other big one for me is that people think there is some sort of secret agenda that the funding bodies or the panels, have some unwritten rules or written but not communicated rules that are determining outcomes, and it's just not the case. The panels assess things on the basis of what they write down in the panel criteria document, and they are, incredibly rigorous at sticking to that, and there is no kind of hidden agenda. But you regularly, hear people say, you need to have this type of output in order to do well, or this type of methodologies does better than that type of methodology. All of those things, if they're not written down in the panel criteria, they're absolutely not things that are being considered by the panels. And I think that's a constant myth that's been around the whole time I've been involved.
We do have, you will get this. We do have a section, specifically on this podcast about REF folklore. And, a lot of that is, academic conspiracy theories that primarily center around the REF as a tool of control or a tool of secrecy. And it's good to hear that that's not the case. They are very rigorous. Simon, you're about to say something.
Yeah, I was thinking exactly the same thing about the REF mythology. There's so much, the folklore that we come across when we go out and talk to people, and people hold on to it really quite strongly. They have this very strong we've done this in the past and it's worked, so it must be that way. So it's really good to have that confirmed. This is not the way, what's written down, the way that the guidelines are written are now how the REF is conducted. But I was thinking about the way you were talking about, what the REF is about. And I was thinking, actually most people, and I hate to say it, but most people, when you talk to the researchers who are at the coalface, many of them see it as a sort of bureaucratic exercise rather than something that's got this sort of purpose, and it's pushing research culture and research in a particular direction. So how do you describe what the REF is actually for?
I think, we have, the REF has stated purposes, and one of them is around providing evidence to inform the allocation of funding, which I already talked about. The other one is around accountability. and demonstrating that universities are producing research of high quality for the funding that they receive. And then the third purpose that we always talk about, which has changed its wording a bit over the years, but it's essentially about the REF as a source of evidence for other purposes. So, it tells us where strengths and weaknesses are in the system. It tells us where there are, new expanding capabilities within the system, those types of things. So those are the reasons that we do it. We don't, this is another one of the things that, is a bit frustrating when you're involved in the REF, is that there is this kind of idea that you're doing it out of some sort of sadistic pleasure of inflicting this process on universities and researchers. If we could find other ways of doing it that were less bureaucratic but still as effective, then I think everyone would be up for that. Researchers, universities, and the people who run the REF. That kind of it's just bureaucratic is a bit of a misunderstanding, I think.
I mean, it's always going to be a balance, isn't it? You want it to be less bureaucratic, but you want it to be just as rigorous. And sometimes those two things, contradict each other. The main example that comes to mind is the idea that you can replace the entire peer review, section for CKU with metrics, for example. Yeah. Yes, we can get machines to do it. We can get metrics to do it, but it's not the same thing as being rigorous.
Yeah, absolutely. Or it's a different, I guess there's a kind of philosophical question underpinning all of this about whether there is a kind of Platonic correct answer, and what we're trying to do is design a system that gets us as close as possible to that, or whether, and this is the view I subscribe to, that there are many different answers, and how you do the assessment will determine which answer you get. And as a collective community, we are currently much more comfortable with the approach that says it's based on peer review and human judgment and all that. The metrics approach produces a different answer, and you could argue is, maybe that in the future will be the answer that we want. But at the moment, the answer we want is the one that's based on human judgment and peer review. So that's the way I tend to think about it. Obviously there are, you talked about this idea that you could replace everything with metrics. There are, serious problematic issues with that, even setting aside my notion that, there's no perfect answer, because that approach won't even give you an answer for certain disciplines and certain types of research. So it's not that it's giving you an inappropriate answer, it's just not giving you an answer at all. And that's a really fundamental problem.
Yeah. Or it's giving you a different answer. And some people, for example, if we go back to the idea of research culture, there are some people who were very against it, and it was driven by uncertainty in the sector and uncertainty that they would give you a different answer. So the question is, if you replace it by metrics, would it change the outcome? You said maybe. But is that the outcome that proponents want? That is yet to be seen, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the thing I find when answering this question about what the REF is actually for, is that actually when a lot of people are ready to sort of complain about the REF and about the amount of time it takes and the fact that they're not doing their research and they're having to deal with other things. But actually when you go through, as you pointed out, the reasons for actually running it, most people agree. Nobody wants a world where they're entirely unaccountable and that we have no idea what's going on within universities. So it's really about, I think, minimizing that cost to people is why they're arguing that they want to know, well, why are we doing this at all? We should be just focusing on research. So I guess the way that you could adapt that question is kind of, what would you think for the 2029 REF? What would success look like for you if we from the perspective of you and from a researcher?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I think it's difficult, or you need to separate the success from the point of view of the exercise itself, and then from the impact that it has on the system. And I would say that the impact on the system is, it's important that the exercise runs efficiently and effectively and is rigorous and all those things. So I that's one of the outcomes that I would see as being really important, that people have confidence that the process has been run properly and that the panels have done their job, and that the outcomes in terms of the the relative scores are reasonable ones that people can get behind for the next batch of funding. But I think the thing that I would hope would be the big impact of REF 2029 is this kind of turn to research culture, which is not something that the REF has created. Absolutely not. This was a movement that was already going long before we even conceived about what REF 2029 would look like. But the hope that I would have is that through the changes that we've made in REF 2029, we actually accelerate the progress of that change around research culture. So, the good outcome for me was that we preserve the quality of knowledge generation and the quality of impact that the UK higher education system has, whilst at the same time improving research culture and making research in our universities a better place to work, and that then in the future starts a kind of virtuous cycle of improving culture leading to improving outcomes, and we can drive up performance even further through that enhanced and positive research culture.
Indeed.
I'm interested in how the adoption of this research culture is across the sector, and I don't know about you, Gemma, but certainly within my university, within the universities I've worked more closely with, it's much more of a thing in this REF. So it's being taken a lot more seriously, entirely because there's been a focus on it in the REF guidelines. So I think it's got this. For me, the REF has this amazing power to sort of drive thinking across the sector, and there's so few exercises that actually do that across all universities. It's usually just led by individuals. I don't know, what do you find, Gemma?
For me, research as a culture is something that I was on board with, long before it was a REFable criterion. I mean, the research that I do means that you've got to see it. And not only that, but we see it as layers. So the fact that you can't separate research culture from institutional culture from, national-based cultures is normal for me. That being said, the way it's been adopted in universities, it's a bit perfunctory, I think. It is driven by performance. There's a lot going on that are addressing long-term disparities in the research system, culture, career, gender, racial, disability, all the rest of it that the REF didn't cause. But I don't know. It'll be interesting to see. I mean, it's great that these discussions are being had and that they're being had so openly. Whether or not it will change things, I'm not sure. From an institutional perspective, I think in the sector at the moment, institutions are looking at how can I achieve the same outcome with the least amount of time and money investment because of the financial sector, the financial situation the sector's facing, but also because REF is such a driver of change that at least in this early part, it seems to be low-hanging fruit, similar to what we saw in Impact in 2014, 2012, 2013, prior to this submission. I'm hoping it will be something that will become a long-term discussion, but at the moment, I'm a bit critical of it, perhaps, because it seems to be performance-led, not change-led. I don't know. What do you reckon? What do you think?
It's the big dilemma when you're making policy interventions in this kind of space, because ultimately you want people to change because they see the value of the change, not because there's some external measure that says we're going to judge you on this thing. But we know from experience that change like that can be incredibly slow. And, when you introduce something like the REF into this, it has the potential to accelerate that change, but at the same time, make that change less valuable or well embedded. And so, that's always a dilemma with any kind of policy intervention. And, we had similar discussions and arguments about open access and the introduction of open access requirements into the REF, where, those of us who advocate for open access and believe it's the right thing, we would love everyone just to decide it's the right thing to do and to do it. But the reality is that if you rely on that, change is going to be incredibly slow. And it was incredibly slow in terms of open access, but funders putting in mandates and an introduction of a requirement in the REF massively accelerated that change, but it hasn't embedded the rationale for that change. It's just caused people to comply, and then maybe over time, compliance leads to a kind of appreciation of benefits and a more embedded kind of change. So yeah, it's a big dilemma, but equally, you can't really, if you want to see a change in the system and you have policy levers to pull, you can't really stand back and not pull them and say, well, we'll just wait for things to evolve.
I agree. I mean, Goodhart's law is as soon as you start measuring something, it becomes a bad measure of, so yeah, I get that. And it's really great to hear that. Yeah, we know that people are going to be performative about it, but that's not a reason not to pull the lever in the first place. I guess that's the same sort of thing we have at the hidden ref, for example. We know that non-traditionally submitted outputs or diverse outputs, however you want to call it, are difficult to evaluate using standardized tools, but that's not a reason for them not to be put forward to be evaluated, which is entire rationale around hidden ref, wouldn't you say, Simon?
Oh yeah, well, this is a perfect segue into a question around hidden ref, I'd argue, because I mean you were an early supporter of the hidden ref, perhaps on the periphery because you have to stay non-partisan, but you came along to the first festival and you talked about the work that Research England was doing around not traditionally submitted outputs, and obviously we came to you and we got funding for this ref cycle. So I think one of the things that sort of really interests me is when you talk to individuals in the sector, and like literally any individual, they will talk about the importance of not traditionally submitted outputs to their research. So why do you think the sector's sort of struggled to actually recognise NTOs in their ref submissions?
So I think there's two things I would say to answer that. One is that it's maybe going back to some of these ref myths that we were talking about. And so I think there are myths about you'll never get a 4-star score for a podcast or whatever.
For this podcast, you would.
This podcast, obviously, 5-star podcast, obviously. But so that's one part of it, I think, is that kind of mythology. I think there are some genuine, I don't need to tell you this, but there are genuine challenges in assessing not traditionally submitted outputs. The big one for me is that a journal article and book, it tells the story of the research. It doesn't just provide, it's not just the, here are the results we got. It explains why the authors think it's significant, rigorous, and original. And so when an assessor's looking at that, they've got at least a starting point for those criteria, what the author thinks, and then they're making a judgment about, to what extent they agree with the story, the narrative that the author is telling. Many non-traditionally submitted outputs don't have that story embedded in them. So, the performance or the exhibition catalogue or whatever, the research story is not transparent within those outputs. And so it's more effort, both on the part of the submitter in terms of producing text that tells that story, if that's what's required, and on the assessor in actually trying to understand that story that sits behind the output. So I think that's a genuine challenge, and why people are wary about submitting these types of outputs, and why the work you're doing in the hidden ref is so important, because it helps. One of the things it's doing, I'm sure, is helping people understand those stories that sit behind not traditionally submitted outputs in a more transparent way. I guess the other final thing I'd say on this is that is a kind of structural issue, although I guess at the moment most of the not traditionally submitted outputs come from a smaller subset of panels, and they tend to be in the, I'm not saying that's necessarily where we ought to be, but they tend to be in the arts and humanities panels, and there's probably a bias in senior leadership in universities where senior leadership is less likely to be from those disciplines. So you have senior leaders in universities who are from disciplines that really aren't considering these, that a performance as a research output is completely foreign if you're a life scientist. And that may affect submission decisions too. And it's just a kind of foreignness and otherness of those types of outputs. Although, I hesitate on that because on that point, because I do think there are not traditionally submitted outputs right across the range of UOAs, but at the moment it tends to be the arts and humanities UOAs where they're being submitted.
So I found, so certainly we've been doing a lot of this work recently, and Gemma and I were talking about it only yesterday to the University of Arts London. And when you actually look at the NTOs that are submitted across panels, it's 10.2% to panel D and it's 0.07% to panel B, which is like my home panel. And the type of outputs vary as well. So there are lots of performances and exhibitions, obviously, in panel D. But panel C, lots of external reports for external bodies, and in panel B, not very much of anything, but there should be tons and tons and tons of software and data and things like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. We're not advocating that main panel A or B should put performance through as a non-traditionally submitted output, or that's appropriate. Although I think a lot of bioinformatics would perhaps be better communicated through interpretive dance, but that's aside. But there are other types of outputs too. You would think patents, for example, would be prominent in main panel A, and software or databases and patents in main panel B. Main panel C, which is the social sciences, it is so interdisciplinary, the way the social sciences operate at the moment, that there are different types of ways in which to communicate to your audience, and some of those might be through non-traditionally submitted outputs. And main panel C was one of the worst offenders when it came to non-traditionally submitted outputs. So you're not just in the bad book, Simon, with your panel B. It's wide across. But even in panel D, and I think we've made this point when we're talking to the University of Arts London, even the argument is, especially against our acronym, is no, you can't call it non-traditionally submitted outputs because for our discipline, these are normal. And yet in main panel D, where that argument is the strongest, only 10.2% of the overall submissions to REF were from non-traditionally submitted outputs, which kind of suggests that, yes, there might be traditional outputs, but they're non-traditionally submitted outputs when it comes to the REF. And so for there seems to be a mismatch between what the REF intends to do, evaluate the excellence of research, within disciplinary, guises or umbrellas, and perhaps what is, the disciplinary, norm about how to communicate to their publics in the best way possible. So it's interesting that when it comes to REF operationalizing, it really actually only increases or exacerbates the divide rather than, evaluate.
Yeah, it's interesting because my anecdote, I won't name the university that I'm about to talk about, but it's not University of Arts London, just to be 100% clear, as they've already been mentioned. But I was speaking to a university a year or so ago that has a very high level of activity in art and design, and they told me that their policy, so this is a matter of policy within that university, is that even though the most important outputs that come from that design research are artifacts, objects or policies, or artifacts of one type or another, they have a policy within their institution that academics should write journal articles about those artifacts and submit the journal articles. And that for me, goes to the heart of why this is such an important issue, because it means that those academics are spending time working on journal articles that they could have been spending on doing more fantastic design work and generating more artifacts that change the world, because that's what they do in that institution. But their interpretation of the REF, even in a very in a discipline area that's, you would imagine would be very heavily dependent on not traditionally submitted outputs or artifacts as their endpoint. As a matter of policy, they're moving against that. So I do think this is an really important agenda.
Researchers don't know too. So I was talking to a researcher who was on main panel B, Simon, yours, and I was going through their impact case study from one of the refs. I can't remember which one, and it was a series of databases, created databases, and I said to him, these databases are refable as outputs because they were outputs at that point. And he was like, oh, no, but we published the papers. And I went, no. Those databases, you could have submitted them instead of the publications. And his face fell, and he was like, I spent 2.5 years writing those publications.
Yeah, exactly.
And you were just like, oh, and I think it's because researchers don't know. They don't know. And I think one of the things we're doing is giving them the tools necessary for them to advocate for themselves and their contribution at the institutional level, not necessarily change REF, which is, what we would like to happen at least. But when it comes down to it, it's the institutions making these decisions, and researchers are not aware of their inclusion.
Yeah, and it comes back to another myth, which is there's a myth that things have to have been peer reviewed in order to be submitted to the REF. And obviously that means for a whole slew of outputs, there is just no infrastructure to have had them peer reviewed in advance of submission to the REF, not least preprints, which are also perfectly legitimate outputs to be submitted. So that peer review myth does feed into this. So people say, well, my data set isn't peer reviewed, I can't submit it, or my report for a government agency isn't peer reviewed, so I can't submit it. Those types of things are, you come across that regularly.
I think one of the things we see when we're running the NTO workshops, there's a lot of what the ref moments for people as they go, like, hang on, there are 22 categories, but I think it's this issue that you talked about earlier on, Stephen, which is where there are lots of reasons why NTOs aren't currently being submitted, and it's because policies are directed against them. It's because they think peer review is necessary. It's the folklore around it, and all of these. And then there's no real experience to draw on because so few NTOs are submitted in the first place. And then when that happens, and this is entirely understandable, the people who are responsible for the submission fall back on what they know. And well, what happened last time, what worked last time, we'll do more of that.
Yeah, so I think the ref system is a form of peer review, so it might not have been peer reviewed before in a journal article, but it's being peer reviewed now. And so just this layering of, peer review as a quality control measure. We won't go into literature, but there's a lot out there about that failing as well. But the ref is, and keeping it, robust and a good assessment, human-based judgment about, whether this is good, original, rigorous, and significant, is in addition to that peer review, but it's not to supplement that peer review. So really it negates the reason for having peer review in the first place in an output. But I would say, I don't know.
I'm really interested in what you were saying as the lack of story around an NTO. And this is something we keep coming across in NTO workshops. And one of the things that we're thinking about is like portfolio outputs, basically, that are often submitted under panel D. And you could see them being really useful for other NTOs across other panels because it provides you that opportunity to give the narrative, to explain why this is like excellent research, provide the story that you were talking about. Have you ever? What's your thinking around portfolio outputs and their role around NTOs and submissions in general?
Yeah, I think they're really important. I guess one of the cautions I would have on this is that portfolios, in the kind of extreme sense of portfolios, can be a lot of work to pull together. So it is actually putting an extra burden on people whose research outputs are different. They're not, not in that, classical journal article or book format. But I do think giving people the space to provide some additional information that contextualizes their output is really valuable. And I think, trying to do that in ways that doesn't pose an excessive burden, if the burden is as much as writing the journal article about the artifact, then they may as well write the journal article about the artifact and submit that. But if by writing a few hundred words that explains the research process that's gone into the generation of the artifact and gives a scaffold for the assessor to actually make their assessment on, then I think that's super valuable, and that's almost certainly the direction that we ought to be going in.
So one of the things I've always been interested in, and it's the reason that we originally set up the hidden ref, was it was about hidden roles. My community, the research software engineering community, I've always been a supportive of that role within academia, and so I was wondering how the ref has evolved to accommodate more research roles, because the original earlier exercises, it seemed very much focused on academics, but now we're talking about a much broader range of people who contribute to research. So how do you feel that the ref has evolved to understand the contributions of these diverse roles?
Yeah, so I think the big change which we made for REF 2029 in response to that challenge was to allow research outputs and indeed impact case studies to derive from the work of anyone who's connected with the submitting unit, not just the academic staff. So I think that's a really important change, because it opens up a whole range of research outputs potentially that weren't eligible in the past, and it also allows staff who are not academic staff but are contributing to research to get direct recognition for what they do, in addition to potentially being co-authors on journal articles and whatever. And it links to the hidden to the not traditionally submitted outputs to an extent as well, because if you're a research software engineer, then the outputs that you generate are going to be software, and so those two things need to link together. And similarly, if you're a technical professional, you might have contributed some methodological development that might end up being written about in a journal article, but maybe deserves its own output of some sort to actually really tell people properly about the new methodological development that you've made. Everyone in the science world knows the methods sections in papers aren't usually good enough to actually replicate the method, especially if it's something new and innovative. So I think having that change in the rules around output eligibility, I think, is an important piece in improving this recognition for all of the people who are needed to make a successful research endeavour.
It was certainly a high point of my career, seeing that change come through. And that was in the Future Research Assessment, I think, and the report that came out of that. And it was actually something.
You were on the phone to me at the time, and we were just very excited. We're like, oh my God!
What are we going to campaign for now?
Well, I don't think you should abandon your campaigning, because I still worry about the extent to which that provision will actually be taken up in the next REF. So I think that will be a really interesting research question for someone to look at after REF 2029. Was, okay, it was possible to submit technical professionals or research software engineers' work, but was it actually done? And you might be in a similar position with, as we are now, with not traditionally submitted outputs. They've been eligible forever, but they're still only a tiny percentage of the submission. So your campaigning is not over.
And we've just extended it. That's all. I think you've highlighted the basis in which the hidden ref is. The problem is not the ref. The ref is very inclusive. 22 different types of outputs. Now, research staff and a variety of different guys or hidden roles. But the extent in which institutions choose that is a risk-based performative decision, not necessarily compliance to the rules.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. I get to ask the next question, though. So, Stephen, I cannot remember how many years you've been at Research England, or you were at Research England. Do you have a number, or?
I do. It's 13.
Okay, 13 years at Research England. I
was at RCUK for 5 years before that, so I kind of figure that's my time in research funding. Just coming up to 19 years. Yeah.
Oh my goodness! I mean, that's incredible. And now you've moved to the other side. Away from the dark side or to the dark side, I'm not really quite sure. Tell us, what's next for you? What are you planning to do?
So I'm really excited to be joining Digital Science, which I think is not on the dark side at all. I think it's a fantastic organisation. I wouldn't, would I, if I'm choosing to work?
It'd be very bad for your promotion or your career if you say at this stage it's the dark side.
What attracted me to Digital Science, I think, was that they have this fantastic ethos and mission to support the research system to be the very best it can through the provision of data and analytics and software tools. And I think there's an enormous scope for doing that. I think the thing that really attracts me is that I think more than ever, research systems at all sorts of different levels need to be making better and evidenced decisions. So I would put that at the level of national policy. I would put it at the level of funders. I would put it at the level of individual institutions. All of these actors in the system need to be making evidence-based decisions about which research to focus on, what priorities to pursue, what things to play down, how to support their researchers, how to get research culture right. All of these things that need good evidence. And I think the types of tools that digital science have the potential to do that for institutions and to support that better decision making about research. So I think that's the kind of big picture why I'm excited to join digital science. I think we can help research organizations make better decisions along with a lot of other things. And I think the other area that I'm really interested in, which again fits with digital science's mission very strongly, is how we can get better data, more real-time data about research impact, both to help in assessment, but also perhaps more importantly, to help in that strategic decision making so that people can identify impact early in the cycle, focus resources to deliver positive outcomes, and so on. So I think that's a very kind of particular thing that excites me about the new role as well.
So not controversial at all.
No, not at all. Not at all. Okay.
But what about it? I mean, are you looking at REF with like a bit of an arm's length, but from a different perspective? What are you hoping to learn on this side? Or
yeah, so I say definitely looking at it from a different perspective, and I think one of the things that I might be involved in a bit in the digital science role is doing some of the research into the REF and how it works, and using the fantastic data sources that we have available to actually look at that. I think in the last few years of my time at Research England, my relationship to research assessment was becoming much more about the international landscape and actually, how other systems globally are evolving in terms of their national research assessment processes. And I'm still going to be very involved in that type of activity, particularly through the Research on Research Institute, which, is a collection of funders that are doing similar but very different things around research assessment globally, and the kind of comparative analysis around that is really interesting. And there's a general trend towards more data-driven and more AI-enabled and augmented assessment approaches, and I think that's a really exciting area for the future. Notwithstanding, Gemma, the points you were making earlier about the caution we need to have around handing off too much of these important assessment decisions to machines.
No, I'm just thinking more about the people behind the machines are my concern, but
Yeah. Well, at digital science, we're all lovely people, so you don't have
I know. Dan, you get to work with Dan Hook. I have all the time in the world for Dan. He's awesome. So yeah, lucky you.
So basically, I think all that's left to do is to say just a huge thank you for appearing on the podcast, Stephen, and indeed for your support, not just for the Hidden Ref, but for the whole concept around the work that we are trying to get changed, the culture we are trying to get changed. And my best of luck at digital science, and thanks again for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Thanks. So thanks so much to Stephen Hill for an amazing interview. I think that was one of the better interviews we've ever done. Hey, Simon?
It was fantastic. It was great having him on the pod.
And we're certainly getting more efficient at doing this podcast, including the intros and the outros, can I say. Please do remember to subscribe to this podcast. You can find us on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you have any questions for either myself or Simon or any of the Hidden Ref team, please do get in contact with us at wtref@hidden-ref.org or WTF@hidden-ref.org, whatever you fancy. Otherwise, thank you for joining us. See you later.
Bye-bye.